respected HOD and dear teachers and dear students of the college and the department, I salute you all. Good morning to all of you, and I am really indebted for this opportunity to speak before you about the gendered subaltern in performance and also an performance. So, in this context of growing inequalities and aggressions and violence in our society, we often think of the people who are toiling under the heavy kind of burdens that are inflicted upon them. And the society and the polity and also the education system, all these sectors are affected by the kind of transformations that have happened, the upheavals, the turbulences that have happened in our society in the last few decades. So, in this context of, struggle, we are talking about performance, theatre, cinema, and other artistic media, and how the subaltern, how the people, because it is often a synonym for the people. Antonio Gramsci is the Italian philosopher, the Marxist thinker, who actually coined that term subaltern in his prison notebooks. In particular, as you are studying in the undergraduate and postgraduate classes, it is Antonio Gramsci in his struggle against Italian classical form of fascism in the early 1930s and 40s. He actually coined that term, the subaltern. And he used it in modern Italian language as a synonym for the people at the bottom, the people at the periphery, the people who are alienated by power-centric kind of discourses, especially totalitarian power, and how power dehumanizes people, how centralized power structures, how totalitarian kind of formations, how autocratic tendencies, how oligarchy, that is another keyword from Antonio Gramsci, how oligarchy destroys the voice and agency of the people, and how it ravages democracy, and it creates a kind of totalitarian centralized power structure, very repressive, very hegemonic. It is again another coinage by Gramsci, the subaltern and hegemony, and the people coming to hegemony. That was his dream. That was the dream project of Antonio Gramsci, how a socialized democratic system can come to existence. And for that, you need the real representation of the people. Only through just and adequate actual representation of the people you can achieve this peacefulness and balance in a society and polity. And that was his dream, the subaltern coming into political power. But unfortunately, that is not the situation. The situation is the opposite and the worst, especially in places like India. The people are not heard. The people and their voices and spaces are extremely diminished and excluded and otherized and marginalized, and a few chosen elites, the historical elites. Gramsci was analyzing the historical bloc in Italian society. How in the Italian society the feudatories and the old elites, how they have captured power and monopolized power, and how they have alienated the people, especially the most downtrodden, the disenfranchised sections, the weaker sections of the society. So Gramsci was making a very serious prophetic kind of postulation on democracy and socialized society, while he was critiquing the kind of fascistic tendencies within the Italian society. So it's a universal kind of critique of power, of totalitarian kind of fascist, pro-fascist kind of mobilization that Gramsci has done, and that is very much relevant today. Today, for all the societies, even outside Europe, in India and in many places of South Asia, where we have this kind of pro-fascist, kind of majoritarian, kind of ultra forms of nationalism, ultra and jingoistic nationalism emerging as a kind of what you call pro-fascist mobilization of the masses. So we need to remember our Antonio Gramsci and his key concepts like hegemony, which is not a direct kind of rule and repression, but it is a very, what you call, very indirect and subtle form of power. It is the rule by consent. You create a consent within the society. You create a common sense in society. You distinguish between the common sense, which is the prevalent sense, which is a dominant ideology, or the false consciousness, as Marx would put it earlier. So he critiqued that common sense, and also he criticized the consensus that is created through the generation of this common sense, through education, through the what you call public instruction, through the media, through various other official discourses of the state and also the power centers. They create a kind of normalization in society. And this normalization of centralized power is done through creation of the common sense. In India, for example, you talk about the glorious past and the Hindu past, and everything Indian is related as the Hindu thing. But unfortunately, that is not the reality. In reality, India is a plurality. If you study Indian history critically, or in a very engaged and profound manner, you will understand that India is a plurality. There are several streams, not just the Hindu, Vedic or Vedantic, Brahmanical tradition, but you also have the traditions of questioning and challenging and rationalist kind of traditions like Buddhism, Jainism, Ajivaka and Charvaka philosophies, Christianity, almost 2000 years of Christianity, and Islam, more than 1000 years of Islam, and Sikhism, and Zoroastrianism, and so many other religious and non-religious kind of traditions, cultural traditions, and even critical rationalist traditions of the people are there. But unfortunately, all these pluralities and the multiplicities of cultures and traditions are being homogenized, and everything is linked to the so-called Hindu. We were all Hindus. Even, unfortunately, under this hegemonic discourse of Hindu, Hindustani, Delhi kind of discourse, which is a term from the late Gail Ombeth, who passed away a couple of years ago, the sociologist, and who wrote the critical biography of Ambedkar, and also she wrote a book called Buddhism, Challenging Brahmanism and Caste in India, Buddhism in India. So according to Gail Ombeth and many other critical scholars who came from abroad and who studied Indian society, this kind of a homogenizing discourse is a totalitarian, reductionist and very repressive and hegemonic kind of a discourse. So reducing India to the so-called Hindu past and creating a Hindu common sense. This is an example of creating a consensus, the caste Hindu consensus and the Hindu common sense through various discourses, through various official in our pedagogy. Pedagogy is the, what you call the fundamental site through which this kind of a homogenizing discourse is being established and normalized. So we need to question the kind of textbooks that we are studying. We need to question the education system that we are into. And also we need to question and challenge the media discourses at large. The media, academia, and the other civil society discourses, the public sphere discourses are creating and reproducing and reiterating this kind of hegemonic notions of history, society, and polity and all. So that's why Gramsci, he discussed about creating a critical consciousness as the greater aim of education, or as a politically aware individual, as a citizen in a democratic society, you need to create a good sense. He differentiated between the common sense, which is often hegemonic and repressive, and the critical sense. The critical consciousness is called the good sense by Antonio Gramsci. So it is actually the aim of education to create all the individuals, all the students into this kind of human beings having this critical consciousness. Otherwise, he called them as intellectuals. Gramsci termed them as intellectuals, those who are having this critical consciousness, and those who can criticize and find the problems of the common sense. They are called intellectuals. They are called organic intellectuals in a society by Antonio Gramsci. So, he differentiated between the traditional intellectuals who will stand with power and for their purposes of power and getting the shares of power and positions, they will align with the power elite. But on the other hand, there are certain people, those who are having this critical consciousness, they will speak truth to power and they will stand for truth and justice and with who are fighting for justice, and they are called the organic intellectuals by Antonio Gramsci. So it is our greater aim to make every student, everyone among you, an organic intellectual. That should be, or that ought to be the greater goal of education, especially in the humanities, in the critical humanities, in the English discipline, which has become interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary now. We need to go for that multicultural plurality and development of critical consciousness that can create a kind of individuality and an ethical and a socio-political kind of stance, a vantage that can produce an ethical vantage for each student. So Antonio Gramsci's seminal contribution in defining the subaltern is very important. He talked about subaltern as the most excluded people at the bottom, the disorganized workers, women, and also the weaker sections of the society, like the untouchables of Europe, the Roma, for example, the untouchables of Europe, the Romani, or the Romas, or the Gypsies, or the tramps and the vagrants, such weaker, excluded sections of the society. They are termed as the subaltern. Antonio Gramsci, it is basically from the military register that he has taken that term subaltern. It means a soldier of inferior rank, and then he used it to elaborate or to refer to all the disenfranchised, all the alienated, excluded people who are not given representation in a society, who are not heard in a society, who are not given an opportunity to express their mind and agency in a society. So the agency and voice of the people, the representations of the people, both political representation as the share in government, and also the cultural, socio-cultural and greater civilizational representations of the people as a society, as part of the culture of civilization. So those kinds of greater capital representations are also the cultural capital representations, or the symbolic capital representations are also acknowledged by Antonio Gramsci. So it is a very important and powerful kind of critical concept to deal with the society today in India and in many parts of the world Let me acknowledge that. So it is from Antonio Gramsci that the Indian Subaltern Studies Group in the 1980s, Ranajit Guha and Partha Chatterjee and many elites of the Western academia, they were all Indian elites, mostly educated in India and abroad, and from the elite sections of the Indian society, so they got opportunity to go abroad, and many of them were in Britain and in USA in the higher academia. Spivak herself, she was at Columbia then. So Spivak and Chatterjee and Guha and all, they have created that group. Of course, later it was exposed as an elitist kind of discourse. They have done a kind of foundational contribution by bringing that or adapting that particular term of Antonio Gramsci. The subaltern term was taken by them, and they have implemented that term or applied that term here in the Indian South Asian context of caste society, caste and gender society, and they have created another term, Gayatri Spivak in particular. She is known for that term, the gendered subaltern. So, subaltern originally from Antonio Gramsci, the Italian philosopher, and then Gayatri Spivak, she has critically extended it from Gramsci, and she has used it to refer to the people, the subjugated people, especially under colonialism. She was, as you know, is one of the leading critics of post-colonial studies and post-colonial theory. So she used it to refer to the colonial and post-colonial context, especially to women in the colonized society in India. And that was in that late 1970s essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? It is having many, many kind of editions and many modified versions. So in the 1988 essay, for example, Can the Subaltern Speak? She talks about women as subaltern, women as the sexed subaltern, women as the gendered subaltern, because it is a crucial gender hierarchy that is existing in traditional societies in India. The patriarchal society, Brahminical patriarchy is the norm and the rule in India. Even among the minorities, the Brahminical patriarchy has made inroads, and they also claim that kind of Brahminical parentage and cultural claims and lineage and elitism and so-called exclusions and purity pollution riddles. So it is reproduced anyway because of the kind of traditional aristocratic patriarchy in India. So under this traditional patriarchy of India, and also under the colonial regime, the image of the woman disappears. Women are not given voice consciousness. Women are not given agency and voice. Even for the Sati debate, that is the debate that she touches upon in that essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? I think most of you are studying that essay. For the MA course, I think it is a textbook. So, in that essay, especially in the 1988 version of Can the Subaltern Speak, Gayatri Spivak talks about the kind of shadowy existence of women. The second class or the third-rate citizenship of women, because even during colonialism, even after the advent of modernity, after the French Revolution and the Magna Carta and the continental philosophers, Hegel and Kant and many others who wrote about the human and the progress and the reason and modernity at large, the Enlightenment project of modernity, even after the advent of modernity, women were not treated as equal. Not just in India, even in Europe they were not given. Until early 20th century, they were not given their voting power, their exercise of franchise. So, these kind of omissions, whether it is done by the Brahminical patriarchy in India or the white supremacist capitalist heteropatriarchy of the West, that is the critique raised by womanists. Womanists like Alice Walker, Toni Morrison or Bell Hooks, they talk about that white capitalist heteropatriarchy, white supremacist capitalist heteronormative. Hetero means heteronormative, that kind of patriarchy in the West. So women's voice consciousness were not heard. Their agency and voice were rejected or not acknowledged even by the British imperial forces or the administrators when there was a debate on sati. They were not asked whether they actually wanted to die on the pyre of the dead husband. That is the inhuman, the barbaric custom called sati. That is the sati debate. Unfortunately, many sociologists legitimized the kind of practice that was there as a traditional kind of convention and so on and so forth. It was seen as some population control mechanism by many sociologists, unfortunately. Many, even postmodern, I am not naming them, you know. So even the postmodern people, they celebrated sati as a what you call regulatory mechanism within the caste Hindu society, the traditional Orthodox society of India. Gayatri Spivak, she argues that women were not at all consulted on this debate. There were many debates, the administrators, those what you call the viceroys and the higher administrators and all those people, and even the pandits and the Brahmanical priestocracy and the community leaders, many caste Hindu leaders were also consulted, but they were all men. They never asked women whether they actually wanted to continue this kind of an inhuman practice, ascending the pyre of the dead husband. In history only you have Kandappan ascending the pyre of his dead wife, that is Nangeli. In that, what you call that breast tax issue, when Nangeli did that sacrifice in Chertala, in 1803, that is the only instance when a husband, he was not there. You might have seen it in that popular movie by Vinayan. You might have seen that episode when Shirigandan or Kandappan, when he reached back, he saw the pyre of his wife, Nangeli. After the sacrifice, she chopped off her breast in order to protest against that inhuman breast tax of Travancore. This happened in 1803. There is a book by N.K. Jose, Dalit Bandhu N.K. Jose on Nangeli and the Mulachi Parambu. That place is still called Mulachi Parambu because she chopped off her breast as a protest of biopower, and politics of the Subaltern against that inhuman tax system, the tax on the Avarna breast. The tax on the Avarna heads and the Talakaram and Mulakaram and so many, 100 and more taxes on the Avarna, the untouchable in Travancore. And after that sacrifice, she bled to death. And soon the Travancore regime, they have to withdraw that particular tax. And that is the story of the breast tax, the infamous breast tax of Kerala or Travancore. So, this is the only instance where a man has ascended the pyre of a dead wife. That is done by Kandappan according to legend and the belief of the people in Chertala. Even today there are relatives of Nangeli living in Chertala. So, that is the only instance. According to Gayatri Spivak, women were never consulted during the sati debate, and because they were not considered as equal and worthy of consultation. They were not treated as human. They were subhuman. They were treated as equal to the Chandala or the Shudra, the lower Shudra, Ati Shudra or Chandala in the caste society. They are all equal to Shudra or Chandala, the women of all Varnas. How Nambudiri women were treated. You know, Marakudakulile, Mahanaragam, you know about all those Kosha and the Marakuda and all those legacies. So, all women of all castes and varnas were treated as the outcasts, as the subhuman or the subaltern. Subaltern, the Italian word means, sub means submerged, underneath, undermined, pushed down under, to the netherworld, and altern means the other. They are considered as the other of the human. Only man is fully human, full-fledged human. So this is a traditional patriarchal kind of discourse that you find both in the Brahmanical patriarchy of India, in the Mullah rule or the Islamic patriarchy of West Asia, and also in the what you call the papal patriarchy of the Christendom, the white capitalist supremacist patriarchy. This is the norm. Women are equal to nigger in courts, because you know it's an abusive ethnic kind of racist slur. Women are equal to nigger in capitalist societies, and women are equal to Chandal and Shudra in the Indian society. So that is why Gayatri Spivak, she argues that women of all castes and varna, they are the subaltern, they are the gendered, not just subaltern. They are discriminated on their varna and their ethnicity and their caste and all, and also they are doubly repressed on gender lines. So it's a double kind of labyrinth. It's a multiple kind of jeopardy that women are experiencing, especially the women of the Shudra and Adishudra varnas and castes. The Dalit women and Dalit Bahujan women, or minority women, they are triply and multiply marginalized. They are having these multiple marginalities and exclusions and multiple jeopardies. So this has created a huge kind of uproar and discourse and further discussions on multiple exclusions, multiple marginalities, and also something called the intersectionality. In the American society, Alice Walker and Bell Hooks and others, later legal studies experts, constitutional and legal experts like Kimberly Crenshaw, Professor Kimberly Crenshaw of Harvard Law School, she has created a special category, a critical concept called intersectionality. You know, the intersection of the roads, the crossroad is called a typical example of intersectionality, the crossroad. So it's a metaphor from traffic that she has taken, and she has used it to elaborate about the multiple exclusions or multiple inequalities existing and crossing over, cutting across or juxtaposed in a particular society. So to refer to the race inequality, the racism of the West, the American world, the racism and sexism and so many other exclusions existing simultaneously in the American society. To refer to that, Kimberly Crenshaw has extended it to the idea of intersectionality. Many forms of inequalities, many graded forms of what we call injustices are simultaneously existing in a given society, according to Kimberly Crenshaw, an African-American legal studies scholar and a constitutional expert in the United States of America, a professor also at Harvard. So these are some of the kind of ideas that give you a kind of broader vision into the notion of the gendered subaltern. Basically from Antonio Gramsci, extended by Gayatri Spivak, and then further discussed and elaborated by various scholars and critics from all over the world, including Bell Hooks, including Gail Ometh, whom I referred to. She was looking into the intersection of caste and gender in India. Many other Dalit Bahujan feminists have emerged with the same kind of critique, like Anupama Rao, for example. She is also in the Western Academy from India, basically. Anupama Rao has written a book called Caste and Gender. V. Geeta has a book called Gendering Caste, the association, the interconnection between caste and gender in India, like the race and gender problematic of the Western world. You have caste and gender as the key kind of intersectionality, the kind of what you call major graded inequalities mixed up in India. So Brahmanic patriarchy, which is a concept from Uma Chakravarti, Professor Uma Chakravarti, a professor of history in India, and she has written that particular essay way back in the 1990s called Conceptualizing Brahmanic Patriarchy. So in that concept also, she takes it basically from Ambedkar, the visionary and the chief architect of the Indian Constitution. So both Anupama Rao and Uma Chakravarti, and also another professor of sociology, Sharmila Rege, who was at Pune Women's University, Savitribai Phule Women's University of Pune. She passed away recently. So her last work is also on this Brahmanical patriarchy, especially Ambedkar on Brahmanical patriarchy. So all the feminists in India, especially the Dalit Bahujan feminists in India, they have taken this key concept, this critical category of Brahmanical patriarchy from Baba Saheb Ambedkar, the architect of the Indian Constitution and the first Law and Justice Minister of India. So this is a very important kind of terrain, a conceptual and epistemological terrain that we are into, the intersectionality of gender and caste and race and multiple kind of inequalities in a society. So in this context, let us come to the arena of theatre and performance, and let us try to, I'm trying to highlight certain instances, certain acts, certain moments in history where you have the gendered subaltern trying to articulate, trying to speak through acts of performance. So performance, you may not limit it to stage or the silver screen or any other cultural performance as such, but performance you can elaborate to various other locations of human life and culture. So performance is nothing but an act of the body through which you are trying to express yourself. You are trying to communicate to the world. You are also trying to create something anew through the bodily movement or the orientations or the choreographed kind of engagement on stage or in a particular space. You are creating a space and you are articulating your voice. That is actually performance. Performance studies also acknowledge these greater, what you call communicative and liberative or self-expressive and self-reflexive kind of dimensions, the what you call liberatory potentials and dimensions of performance. So that's why theatre becomes a metaphor of life and the whole world, as Shakespeare has elaborated. The whole world is a stage and we are merely players on that stage. We have our entrances and we have our exits. So, meantime, we also perform something. We become very performative in our life. That is the insight from another branch of knowledge, which is fast multiplying and transforming the world and transforming itself, called gender studies. Gender studies. We mentioned about the Italian Marxism of Gramsci, the Indian Subaltern Studies group, the post-colonial studies, the ethnic and race studies and caste and gender studies and all. So this is another very important field of inquiry in the humanities and a theoretical kind of movement called the gender studies, especially the works by Judith Butler. And before Judith Butler, Michel Foucault, Judith Butler, and now even Agamben, Giorgio Agamben, they are all revolutionizing this field of gender and sexuality kind of studies. So, along with the minorities, we now count the sexual minorities as well. The trans people are also considered as minorities. In all the developed parts of the world, they are part of the minorities. So, gender studies has given us, especially Butler's work, Judith Butler's work, which you may be studying a few essays from Judith Butler and all, I hope. Can you mention that, that work by Judith Butler? Those who are into gender and LGBT studies, trans studies and all. Basically she wrote in German and it is translated as the gender trouble. the gender trouble, and also bodies that matter. These are the very important, and undoing gender. These are the three important works by Judith Butler on gender. Gender as a sociological and political and cultural category. How gender is a creation, how it is not an essential or a quintessential reality of the world, but it is a human construct. It is the construct of culture, traditional societal norms and practices. It creates the division, the hierarchy. It is not mere a division. It's a hierarchy. Like the caste system, it's a hierarchy. Woman ought to be like this, and men must be like this, and so on and so forth. This is called the engendering program. Engendering program. The girl child is trained and taught and punished and disciplined. You also need to go to Foucault for that. Discipline and punish. Birth of the clinic, birth of the prison, and the 3 volumes of history of sexuality to understand. So before Judith Butler, it was the French philosopher and historian Michel Foucault. Are you studying any essays by Foucault? Perhaps what is an author or on places and all those shorter essays you may be studying. So anyway, you need to read more of Foucault, and then only you can arrive at Judith Butler. So the 3 volumes of sexuality, history of sexuality, 3 volumes Foucault has written. He is a homosexual. He died as a homosexual, and he died of AIDS also. And for that matter, he was excluded from the what you call the mainstream pedagogy for almost many decades. He was excluded. But later, at least from the 1990s onwards, he has been included widely all over the world, even in India. Now, he is the norm in the methodology of the human sciences. In humanities, he has set the agenda, the methodology, the research methodology. His books, The Order of Things, The Archaeology of Knowledge, The History of Sexuality, or The Histories of Sexualities, you can call it more appropriately. These are part of the textbooks now. Now, our research students are studying that. So, we need to read Michel Foucault. There are many films on Foucault. There are many animation, cartoon-like graphic comic strips on Foucault. There are many beginner series on Foucault and post-structuralism, Derrida and Foucault and post-structuralism, and so on and so forth, which you need to read. You can begin your reading through such comic books, through animation kind of cartoons. He's such a very interesting kind of egghead kind of a person. Very interesting to look at, and hilarious and humorous to follow. So you need to read Foucault, The History of Sexuality, to arrive at the issue of gender, the problematic of gender. So it's a very complex human creation. Power has created, mostly patriarchy, ethnocentric, phallogocentrism of the West, says Derrida, for that matter. So when you read Foucault, naturally you will have to look at Jacques Derrida, the other Frenchman, also the critical insider of Europe who questioned the foundations of European or Western metaphysics. That is Jacques Derrida of grammatology, which was translated by that Indian woman. Gayatri Spivak has learned French language to translate Derrida's of grammatology, otherwise called deconstruction, the methodology of deconstruction, how to critically undo and unravel a particular text, how to critically read a text and find out the omissions and evasions and silences and fissures and gaps in that particular text. That kind of a subversive reading is called archie-writing, or the science of deconstruction, according to Derrida. So these are all very important prerequisites to get into the discourse of the gender studies as elaborated by Judith Butler herself. So according to Judith Butler, gender is not natural. Gender is not an essential reality of the world, but it is constructed through very normative social and political cultural practices in society. So it is a construct. There are many scholars. Toril Moy is the gender/textual politics. You have Simone de Beauvoir, who has that work. Can you name that work? Simone de Beauvoir, the French author. The second sex. And from the English tradition, from the 18th century onwards, there were texts. A vindication for the rights of women. A vindication for the rights of women by Mary Wollstonecraft, senior. Okay. So that tradition of feminism has now transformed into more broader and more inclusive form of gender studies or gender and sexuality studies. And Judith Butler is the most prominent kind of figure. And in order to arrive at Judith Butler, you also need to read Foucault and Derrida and even Agamben, Giorgio Agamben, who has talked about the Zooey or the Homo sacer, the sacrificial animal, the kind of state of exception, and the sacrificial animal, human as a sacrificial animal, Homo sacer. These are the very important concepts from Agamben also, Giorgio Agamben. And also, along with Foucault, he is also known for the ideas of biopolitics and biopower. These are all also elaborated by Foucault and Agamben. So, according to Butler, coming back to Butler and gender studies, Butler has elaborated gender as a performative kind of act. It is not a normal kind of nature of the human being, but it is ascribed by the patriarchal society, the ethnocentric, the phallogocentric, ethnocentric society, and we are asked or we are forced or we are normalized or regularized in order to perform these gender functions. The girl child is treated in a particular way and trained in a particular way, and the boy child also trained and conditioned, like the classical conditioning and operant conditioning that we study in educational psychology and pedagogy. We are conditioned as dogs or guinea pigs or chimpanzees. We are trained in our society to act and perform these functions. So gender is performative. So that is why the act of the subaltern in performance, and also subaltern and performance, it is very poignant and very significant, because gender itself is performative. So how can we break and renew and criticize and depart from the kind of given traditions and performance rules in a particular society? So the sites that I have mentioned earlier, the act of Nangeli, when she chopped off that breast, it is an act. It's a performance. It's a very lethal kind of performance. Taking her own life and making a statement that this is wrong. This kind of inhuman taxes are wrong. This is against any rule of ethics and humanity. This can't hold. This must stop. You must end this inhuman thing. And also when Clara Parks, when he refused her seat to a white man in a so-called white-only kind of seating in a bus, in a public transport system in the United States, during the 1960s, during the civil rights movement, Martin Luther and Malcolm X and others, even Maya Angelou was with them. Maya Angelou's own silence is a performance. She never spoke for almost 1 decade and more. After the rape incident, she never spoke a word for almost 12 to 13 years. He kept mum. That silence itself is a glorious kind of performance, a dissent and a kind of grave kind of criticism of this patriarchal world, abusive world that she has experienced. So many such instances are there. So in theatre you have the tradition of women's theatre. It is said that in the Greek theatre you have these women, but we don't find many women authors or playwrights. We have these great Sophocles and others who has written Antigone. Recently that Antigone, a Kazakhstan production of Antigone of Sophocles was staged in Kerala in the International theatre festival of Kerala, Antigone of Sophocles was recreated by a Kazakhstan, Olia Kuli, Kazakhstan playwright and director who is based in Britain. He has done a production, Antigone. A woman has played that role. Recently there was another production on the Lebanon Tales of the Mother. A Lebanese director, Ali Chaurahir. He has created the lamentation of a mother. There was also something called Don't Talk About Me on War, a play from Palestine which was a monologue and a musical rendition. It was also done by a woman performer, a woman poet and musician who came to Kerala and she sang and performed it as a solo performance with musical kind of accompaniment. So now theatre, the world of theatre has changed in a way that women, the gendered subaltern, the sexual minorities, the trans people, the others, they are getting some kind of what you call representation, some kind of cultural representations and opportunities for speaking and articulation, and their agency is now being acknowledged. But we also had that ancient tradition in some of the theatrical traditions within Kerala, if you look. In the Nangiyar Kuthu and that kind of traditions, in the Kuthu and Kudiyattam traditions, you have women as well. Usha Nangiyar, who is my colleague, she has written a kind of performative autobiography of a performer. Abhinetri, that is the title of her autobiographical work in her theatre. She is an artist in the Nangiyar Kuthu tradition, the Kudiyattam tradition, and women's theatrical performance, it is there. But unfortunately, it is not an independent kind of branch. It operates within the limitations. What you see on the Kudiyattam stage or the Nangiyar Kuthu tradition is a kind of mediated and highly what you call regulated form of articulation. It's not an expression of the self, or it is not a kind of liberative kind of free will that you see on stage, but highly mediated and restricted. That's why women on that Kudiyattam stage, they speak Prakrit. While the male characters, they are speaking chaste Sanskrit, elitist kind of Sanskrit variety. Even in language, they are restricted, as in the caste system. You cannot use the same word, the discourse on the debate on Taravadu. Taravadu was called Kuppamadam. The Shudra cannot say my Taravadu to a Brahmin lord. He can only say that my Kuppa. That means my pit. So that kind of a tradition, a restrictive Brahmanical authoritarianism is there. Though there were women's theatre traditions within Kerala. But in recent times, plenty of women, they have broken that. They have also written, Abhinetri is a very interesting work by Usha Nangiyar on these restrictive practices, the liminal spaces, the spaces of limitedness or liminality within the theatre performances traditions. They boast about more than 1,000 years of performance in Kudiyattam. But if it goes beyond 8th century, it should be a Buddhist kind of tradition. Later it was altered. In the Middle Ages, the Ramayana and Mahabharata stories were juxtaposed or infiltrated into that tradition, and that is how women were subjugated. That is why even today women speak Prakrit or Pali on stage, while the male characters, they are speaking the elite variety of Sanskrit on stage. So in recent times, many women, they have written like this. Like Usha Nangiyar, you have that Sajida Mathathil. She has written something called the Stri Nadaga Charitram. Stri Nadaka Charitram. G. Shankarapillai has written that Malayala Nadaka Charitram. As a counter, Sajida Mathathil, the actress, and she's also a writer and or a performer, she has written that book called Stri Nadaka Charitram, Malayala Stri Nadaka Charitram, in which she has rehabilitated many forgotten voices, like Afra Ben. You never talk about the sister of Shakespeare. You never talk about Afra Ben, who has written this much, what you call blockbusters, scintillating works of theatre. But recently, only Harold Bloom, when he wrote that Western canon, he tried to rehabilitate Afra Ben and Felicia Hemans and that Shakespeare's sister and Elizabeth Barrett Browning and plenty of women. Now they are back into the canon. Now they are being placed into the canon by new kind of historiography, new forms of what you call writing the history of literature and theatre. So women were excluded from the canon, and that is why Sajida Mathathil argues that even G. Shankarapillai has excluded the voices of women. Many Saraswati Amma and many early writers in Kerala, they were excluded according to Mathathil. So you can read that work. Madhurabhumi has published that. Sajida Mathathil's Stri Nadaka Charitra. That's an example of dealing with it. And also women, they have written a lot. Just one example, perhaps because we also need time for discussion. So one more example I may cite, Professor Sarah Joseph's work, very important work that was published in book form in 2009, which is called Bhumi Rakshasam, which is an example of a woman's theatrical or performance kind of articulation. Bhumi Rakshasam. We know about her recent novels and Budhini and all those things and Urugaval and all, in which she deconstructs the kind of Hindu epic narratives. So this is a short play called Bhumi Rakshasam, in which she has touched upon the issue of gendering and othering and even genocide that is happening in India in contemporary times. So in Bhumi Rakshasam, which means the land of the demons, she looks into the trajectory and the genealogies of demonization. Because demonization and animalization, these are the tropes, narrative tropes, through which people are disenfranchised, people are alienated, people are otherized before the genocide, and then they are eliminated somehow. So the narrative logic of this othering, that is called demonization. If you demonize, Rakshasavalkarikkuka, allengil Predavalkarikkuka, Pishajavalkarikkuka, demonize and then it is a license to kill. That is the process. So she has looked into that genealogies of demonizing the South Indians, who all people, the people who you find as the animals and monsters, the demons, Rakshasa, Rakshasugal, Predangal, Asuranma, the legacy of the Asura. So this process is called demonization. And who are these people? Are they real demons? Are there real demons and ghosts out there? Or are they people who are demonized? That is the question. So it is actually the South Indians who resisted the Varnashrama regime of North India. It is actually the South Indians who became a threat to the conquest of the Varna towards South. They were demonized in the Hindu epics and Puranas, in the Sanskritic epics. You have plenty of historical kind of backup and substantial elaborations in historians like Kelangulam Kunjambillai and others. Kurangu Pattadagal. They were rendered into Kurangu or apes and chimpanzees. This Bali, Sugriva and Hanuman and Jambavan and those huge birds like Sambadi and Jatayu and all those things, into serpents and apes and chimpanzees and whatnot, all forms of monsters. And Ravan was demonized as a typical Asura because he was from the Sri Lankan territory that was a Buddhist territory from the time of Ashoka. So the religious other is being demonized, otherized and demonized and then slayed. That is the logic that is there. So Sarah Joseph in her work, she is looking into the rape of a demonized other woman. Another woman, Araja, she is called. The heroine of Bhumi Rakshasam is Araja, the daughter of Shukra. Shukra was actually the Acharya, the teacher, the head teacher of the so-called Asuras, Shukracharya as he is called. And Shukracharya's daughter, Araja, and how she was courted, how she was lured and very cunningly how she was co-opted and how she was raped by an Aryan prince, Dandaga or something, I forgot his name. You can read that. The Kairali books, they have published Bhumi Rakshasam. I have written an English article in the Malayalam Literary Survey of Kerala Sahitya Akademi way back in 2015. It is available online on academia.edu. You will get that, The Land of Demons, if you type by Sarah Joseph. You get that article also. You can also read the original. Read the original in Malayalam by Sarah Joseph. You will get the picture. How the people are being, especially the gendered subaltern, the other woman, how they are imagined as other and other woman, and then how they are being thoroughly exploited. They are co-opted. Their energy, their biopower, their body is required for the prince, but after that he discards. After the rape, she is just a rape victim. And the king, the Aryan king, never recognizes her, like what happened to Shakuntala. Another case, if you deconstruct Kalidasa, you will find how she was used by that Dushyanta, and then how he forgot about that thing and all, the ornament, the ring and all. Anyway, this is one example that I would like to cite here. I would like to present before your reading Sarah Joseph's Bhumi Rakshasam as a typical case about the struggle. Unfortunately, it is a tragedy also. The tragedy, like in the case of Bhuvaneshwari Bhaduri, as cited by Spivak, she had to commit suicide during her menstruation because she feared that there would be allegations against her that she was pregnant when she committed that suicide. That is the example in Spivak, in Can the Subaltern Speak. So you can read from Spivak to Butler to Foucault to Sarah Joseph. These are some of the instances of the performance, the life struggle, performance not as an aesthetic expression but as a cultural and political struggle of the gendered subaltern, from Nangeli to Araja, or from that heroine of Ilango. He wrote it here in Madilagam. Ilango has written about Silappadigaram and how that Kannagi, how she has destroyed that Pandian capital, the city of Madurai, the glorious city that was burned down into ashes by the fury of that gendered subaltern, that is Kannagi. Meena Kandasamy, she has re-articulated it, recreated that wrath of Kannagi, the biopower of Kannagi in a poem called Miss Militancy. She calls Kannagi Miss Militancy. A woman, a gendered subaltern who is capable of creating and also destroying the world. That is Miss Militancy, according to Meena Kandasamy, the Dalit poet who is writing in English from Tamil Nadu. So these are some of the instances that I would like to present before you. And with these introductory remarks, let me conclude here. I thank the department, my friend Alvin Alexander and all the HOD and all the teachers and dear students here. And I wish you all the best in your studies and your struggle. Thank you.